This is grape video number 32, Pruning Neglected Grapevines. Well, grapevines can experience neglect in many ways. In this picture, the vines in the foreground experienced neglect in the form of weed competition around them. This is a picture from Grape Video 26 about pruning grapevines before their second growing season. And the vines in the foreground are not anything worth a second year growth yet because of the stress of the weeds around them. So it's not a matter of pruning in this case, it's a matter of weed control, and that is the stress that must be taken care of before we can talk about pruning vines that are mature and have pruning issues. So this video is going to concentrate not on pruning of small stunted vines like this. If you have this situation with weed problems, we're going to talk about weed control in other videos. If you have vines going into their second year, look at Grape Video 26. This video specifically is going to talk about full-sized vines that have experienced neglect in one way or another in the pruning practices that were either applied improperly or not at all. Yes, indeed, not all grapevines get loving care each year. Here's a vine that's just overgrown as a big bush, and this happens in all kinds of situations. It happens in backyards where an arbor may have vines on it and nobody prunes it for a few years. There may be a grapevine growing along the back fence in a yard and it gets left alone for a few years. It can also happen commercially. Here is a picture in the Cuyahoga Valley north of Branchport, New York, way back in September 1974. This is a vineyard that's in a low valley area, and I took this picture back then because it had already succumbed to the first early fall freeze in this low spot, and for that reason this vineyard had been abandoned for years and years by the time I took this picture. It was just a wad of growth, and I used to go there to learn about grape diseases. I put this picture in because if someone wanted to renovate this vineyard for whatever reason, perhaps put in overhead irrigation to control freeze issues, how would you go about bringing such a vineyard back to life, or that vine on the fence in the backyard? That's the nature of this short presentation. Well, here is a row of grapevines that is somewhat neglected. Here we are in May, and look at what is going on. Nothing. What a wad of growth there. I'm going to show you how well we can neglect grapevines at times in some of the viticultural research we do, and then talk about what you might do to bring back vines that have been either abused or neglected or abandoned back to a useful condition. Here is a row of Niagara grapevines that is properly managed with top wire cordon as they're growing on May 22nd back in 2007. Here on that same day are two more rows of Niagara grapevines. The one on the left has just been mechanically pruned. The one on the right we haven't even gotten to yet and may not for a while. I'm going to point out that 5-gallon bucket that we have turned upside down that actually protects a a small piece of irrigation equipment that comes up from the ground, and so we leave that bucket there. But that's going to be a point of reference in some future pictures. So this is not the best care for these vines. And it isn't over yet, because here's a week later and we're still practicing what we call delayed pruning well into the growing season. And that's what that looks like after we're through. And then we go through by hand and clean it out. And we did discover, by the way, you could do this, and the vines performed reasonably well and the crops did ripen. You can see lots of clusters up at the top of the trellis there. But over time, when we did this for years and years, the growth did get away from us, and it got more and more difficult to control that growth. Here we are mechanically pruning some of these vines in about the third or fourth year of this project of delayed pruning. And why did we do that? Because we're growing vines in somewhat of a frost pocket here, and by delaying the pruning we actually can keep more fruiting capacity on the vine later in the spring in case there is a freeze. Nevertheless, it does become abusive over time, especially when we didn't fully attend to these vines as best we could have. So here's what it looks like in the interior canopy of these vines after 5 or 6 years of this management. We just didn't do well enough to keep the canopy open, and it got to be more and more of a mess. And this could be the same thing on a trellis in the backyard or along a fence, or many situations where vines are just not cared for adequately. So we're going to propose a solution to getting this vine back into proper management order. Yep, cut them off at the ground. This is exactly what we did to this small Niagara vineyard so that we could rebuild the vine from the ground up. Here we are, May 23rd, in the year we did this, 2012, and you can see stuff starting to sucker out and grow back. We put this little video clip in so you can perhaps see that we left 6 to 8 inch stubs of trunks in the hope, there you see some stub of the trunk there and there, so that there would be opportunity for suckers to develop either right at the ground level or just up a few inches on the old trunk. And here on that same date is another picture showing the 5-gallon bucket as a point of reference. Now keep in mind, this picture was taken May 23rd. Now we're going to go ahead just 2 months to July 23rd in the same vineyard. Here we go. Isn't that amazing? There's the bucket from a slightly different angle. And so we had in this vineyard about 98% recovery of the vines. And the 2% that didn't come back, I'm not so sure they weren't dead already. But I've seen this done on large commercial vineyards, some of them 20 acres and more, and we usually get 95% or better regrowth when you have the vines cut off at the ground and they come back like this. And you get to restructure the vine in a healthy way. This isn't good. Yes, it doesn't work if you've got grafted vines, but for own-rooted vines, in many situations, this is a wonderful way to bring back neglected vines. You lose a year of cropping, but now we're going to fast forward from 2012 to look at the vineyard in the very next year for this little Niagara vineyard. Isn't that amazing? And yep, there's the bucket. There's the bucket. And we had in this vineyard the year after we cut them off at the ground, a pretty decent crop. Well, here's a picture of that crop. Aren't those beautiful Niagara grapes? We had a 7-ton to the acre crop in the year after we cut these vines off at the ground. Now, not only is this a matter of pruning the vines off at the ground and then bringing up 2 new canes to establish cordons, this also assumes that you're doing reasonably good other viticultural practices, and especially weed control around the vines, because if you don't, you're just not going to get the rebound and the growth of vines like this. Now, I understand that some people might be quite hesitant to cut vines off near the ground and perform this practice. So perhaps you want to try this with a dozen vines if you have many, many vines, and see how that works for you first. Or perhaps you would be willing to do something that's not quite so radical as cutting vines off near the ground. So we're going to give you a couple more options, but I'd still prefer this cutting the vines off near the ground and letting them grow back for a year and then retraining like you're seeing here. But let's look at a couple of other options that might be more appealing to some. Here is a picture way back in 1983 in the San Joaquin Valley in the spring, and what we're looking at is a Zinfandel vineyard that was not harvested the previous fall. Why? Because there was no market for those grapes. Seems strange now, but back in the early 80s, it was the white wine boom. And red wines, Zinfandel here, before we had white Zin and so forth, were really overproduced and did not have a market at any price. So what would happen is these vineyards would be converted to white wine varieties such as Chenin Blanc or French Colombard. I put this picture in because it's the only way I can illustrate another option for taking control of a vine or vineyard that's been neglected in terms of pruning. Here's what was done with that Zinfandel vineyard. The vines were pruned off, all the cordons taken off, and just a stub of trunk about 30 inches high was left. And if we take a closer look, they were grafted. We call this side whip grafting. And that's why I was in this vineyard, to learn this technique. But what I'm putting this picture in this video for is to say, if you don't have the wherewithal to cut your vines off close to the ground, then perhaps cutting your vines off 24 to 30 inches from the ground to let more base buds come out of that longer section of trunk would be a more acceptable approach for you to renew vines that have had pruning neglect. So forgetting the grafts on top of these stubs of trunks, just cut the vines off 24 to 30 inches off the ground, and you will get growth. You will get growth. And you could do this technique with grafted vines. Well, the other possibility is layering. And we've covered layering in a previous video, video 24. So you might want to refresh your memory on that. But if you have a big old vine that doesn't want to throw suckers, like this big old Cab Sauvignon vine, you may want to try to layer it. This is what we put in video 24. There is the layer that we put in. If you want to get more particular about the placement of the new vine trunk, you could put it in this way and do whip layering, so you layer back onto the vine itself and put the new trunk right next to the old one. I find it more convenient just to leave the new trunk between the two vines so that you move the vine spaces all 1/2 space to the left or right. Either way, if you do this, you could take old neglected vines, as long as you've got cane growth that's long enough to do this layering, and renew a vineyard in this way. And this is a picture of my little Cab Saw vineyard, and this is exactly what I'm preparing to do next spring. I've cut everything off and saved. Can you see on the ground there's lots and lots of very long canes? There you go. And next spring, we're going to take those long canes and we're going to layer those in and create a new vineyard with new trunks, because those old Cab Saw vines that are about 18 years old will not allow me to renew them with suckers near the graft union. So we're going to create own-rooted Cab Saw vines from these grafted vines, and then that's yet another project we will present later, and then we will manage them with a new insecticide called Movento for controlling phylloxera on the roots. But that would be another possibility if you are not willing to cut vines off close to the ground and let them sucker back. You could do it by layering, by whip layering. Well, that's it. As per usual, thank you for your attention, and happy grape growing.